Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, and welcome to another weekend book review. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita.
Today, we're going deep into the world of macroeconomics.
Oh, exciting.
And get this.
Yeah.
We're going to try to predict the U.S. economy.
Bold move.
I know, right? So you shared a chapter from Ray C. Fair's book,
Okay.
Macroeconomic Modeling. And it's chock full of really eye-opening stuff.
It is.
You know? So think of this as like your crash course on how economists try to make sense of this crazy world that we live in.
Well, and Fair's work is particularly interesting here because he takes this very data-driven approach. Right. So it's not just theory. You know, you've got to have a model that actually reflects what's happening in the economy, even if it challenges, you know, some of our traditional thinking.
Okay. So no crystal ball.
Yeah.
Just good old-fashioned data crunching.
That's right.
I like that. So one of the first things that jumped out at me was this this Cowles Commission approach that Fair mentions all the time. What is the deal with this approach?
It's actually a bit of a throwback, but Fair argues that it's more relevant than ever.
Okay.
And basically, it's about letting the data lead the way rather than forcing a model to fit our preconceived notions, right? He's not against theory, but he really believes that the numbers should tell the story, not the other way around.
Not trying to jam, you know, a square peg in a round hole.
Exactly.
Make the data fit your theory.
Yeah. Let the data speak for itself.
Yeah. Okay. So how does this data-driven approach actually play out in practice?
Well, Fair uses these massive data sets, right? I mean, on everything, you know, from household spending to government revenue. But he doesn't just throw it in a spreadsheet and hope for the best.
Right.
He uses a method called NL2SLS.
Yeah.
It sounds very complicated.
It's L2SLS, that's a mouthful?
It is a mouthful, but think of it as a way to isolate the impact of different factors on the economy.
Gotcha. So instead of just saying, hey, the economy grew because people spent more, this is a way to really figure out the why behind the spending.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Figure out the cause and effect.
Okay, perfect.
So you can see how all those things are connected.
Okay. So we're starting to see how Fair brings all this data together.
Yeah.
But what about those of us who aren't, you know, walking economic encyclopedias?
Sure.
How does he model the behavior of millions of individuals and businesses and, you know, all these different moving parts?
So he uses something called a representative agent model, which essentially means focusing on the average behavior of households and firms.
So it doesn't mean that everyone acts the same.
Right, exactly.
But it's a way to sort of simplify things.
Yeah, it's a way to make it tractable, right? To sort of capture the overall trends.
It's kind of like taking a snapshot of the entire U.S. population.
That's a good way to put it.
You know, you can't get every detail.
You can't get bogged down in the minutiae.
But you get a sense of the big picture.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between complexity and manageability.
Okay.
And Fair is very transparent about the limitations of this approach. He even points out that choosing different time periods for your data can actually significantly change the results.
That's a good reminder that even with all this data, there's still a lot of judgment involved.
There is.
In building these models.
You can't just plug numbers into a machine and hope for the best. It takes some real expertise.
Okay, so we've got this framework of, you know, data, methods, models. But let's get into like the nitty-gritty.
Let's do it.
I'm particularly interested in how Fair explains something as basic yet complex as household spending. You know,
it's a big one.
It's like the giant puzzle.
It is. It is.
With tons of little pieces, right?
And Fair's model breaks it down into these different types of spending. You know, services, durable goods, housing. And what's really cool is that he factors in things like interest rates, household wealth, even the age distribution of the population. And so he found, for example, that an aging population tends to spend less on durable goods.
Which makes sense when you think about it.
It does.
Yeah. It's like each piece of the puzzle
it's all connected.
is connected to another.
Yeah.
Now, I'm trying to remember, the pandemic had a huge impact on all of this.
It did.
Did Fair just scrap his model and start over?
No, he was actually able to adapt it quite cleverly.
Okay.
He incorporated the pandemic effects by using these dummy variables.
Okay.
Think of them as like special flags in the model that account for those unusual economic shocks.
Right.
So it shows you how flexible and responsive his approach can be.
He's not just building a model in a vacuum.
Oh.
He's making it relevant.
Trying to keep it real.
to real-world events. Speaking of real-world events,
Yeah.
there's a concept in this chapter that really piqued my curiosity.
Okay.
Excess labor.
Yeah.
Why would businesses keep more workers than they actually need?
It seems counterintuitive.
It does.
But it makes sense when you consider the costs
Okay.
associated with hiring and firing.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's cheaper for a company to hold on to a few extra workers,
Right.
even if they're not fully utilized,
Right.
than to go through the hassle of laying them off
Right.
and then rehiring when demand picks up again.
It's like having a reserve team
Exactly.
ready to go when the economy heats up.
A bench, yeah, waiting.
Yeah, exactly. And so this behavior has ripple effects
It does.
throughout the economy.
It explains in part why we see labor productivity rise during booms
Okay.
and fall during busts. It's not that workers are suddenly becoming more or less efficient.
Right.
It's about how companies are managing their workforce
Yes.
in response to those changing conditions.
Okay, so we're starting to peel back the layers of the economic onion here.
We are.
But we can't talk macro without addressing the big elephants in the room.
The big ones.
Inflation and unemployment.
Right.
You know, every time I turn on the news,
That's all you hear about.
it seems like that's all people are talking about.
They are. So, well, those are the key variables, right?
Yeah.
That policymakers are always trying to juggle. And Fair's model tackles them head on through his interpretation of the Phillips curve.
Okay, refresh my memory on that one.
So the Phillips curve basically
see it.
suggests there's this trade-off
Okay.
between unemployment and inflation. So lower unemployment usually leads to higher inflation
Right.
and vice versa, right?
It's like a seesaw,
It is.
trying to find that balance point.
Exactly. Now you might say,
Yeah.
well, wait a minute, that doesn't always hold true.
Right.
What about those times when we see high inflation and high unemployment?
Exactly.
Like what happened in the 1970s?
Yeah, like stagflation.
Stagflation.
That always seemed like a bit of a mystery to me.
Well, Fair would argue that it wasn't a breakdown of the relationship itself,
Oh.
but rather the impact of external factors, like the huge oil price increases
Oh, right.
we saw back then.
Okay.
Those cost shocks pushed up inflation even when unemployment was high.
So the Phillips curve wasn't broken.
Right.
It was just dealing with some serious external pressure.
Exactly.
It's wild.
It is.
To think about how the economy is constantly being bombarded by all these different factors
from
all directions.
And Fair's model really tries to capture those nuances, but we've only just scratched the surface, right?
Yeah.
We haven't even talked about how he brings in finance.
Right, we're talking about the wild world of stock prices,
The whole thing.
housing market,
Everything.
and the impact they have on the economy as a whole.
We could talk about that for hours.
I know. Well, let's take a moment to process everything we've learned so far. It's really amazing to me how Fair can take all of this
Yeah.
seemingly chaotic data
It is chaotic, isn't it?
and create a model
Right.
that actually makes sense.
Helps us understand the connection.
Yeah,
Yeah. It's pretty cool.
it is. It is.
All right, I'm ready to jump back into this world of finance and economics.
Okay, let's do it.
Before the break, we were talking about how Fair's model handles those
Right.
unpredictable things like stock market swings and housing bubbles.
Yeah, those are the tricky ones.
Those always seem like the wild cards to me, you know?
They are, and it's where Fair's approach gets really interesting.
Okay.
Because remember how we talked about him using data to guide the model? Well, when it comes to asset prices like stocks and housing,
Okay.
he just acknowledges that predicting those movements is incredibly difficult.
Yeah. It's like trying to predict
It's impossible.
what meme is going to go viral next week.
Exactly. I mean, who knows?
There's just too many variables, right?
Way too many. So instead of trying to build a crystal ball,
For asset prices,
Yep.
he takes a different approach.
Okay.
He treats those price changes as inputs
Got
to his
it.
model.
so he's not necessarily trying to predict them.
No.
He's saying, okay, this is what happened.
Yeah.
Now let's see what the ripple effect is.
Exactly.
Throughout the economy.
It's like observing the aftermath of an earthquake, right?
Yeah.
You don't know when or where it's going to hit.
Right.
But you can study the impact.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's focusing on the consequence,
Right.
not necessarily the unpredictable event itself.
Exactly.
So let's talk about another big player
Okay.
in this economic ecosystem. The Fed.
Ah, yes, the Fed.
I feel like they have so much power
They do.
to influence the economy, don't they?
They're like the puppet masters.
Really?
Well, not quite. But they do set interest rates.
Right.
They control the money supply.
Okay.
And they're basically the guardians of the financial system.
And so how does FAIR
Yeah.
incorporate the Fed into all of this?
He actually has a whole equation dedicated to modeling the Fed's behavior, specifically how they set short-term interest rates.
How do you model Fed behavior in an equation? I always imagine them in a smoke-filled room.
Right, lots of cigars.
Making these decisions.
Well, maybe there's some of that, but FAIR's model is really focused on what we can observe.
Okay.
Right? Their actions and the things that seem to drive those actions.
But you're looking at historical data.
Exactly.
To see what's motivated them in the past.
Yeah, you look for patterns.
Okay.
Like how they react to inflation or unemployment.
So you're not trying to get into their heads.
No mind reading necessary.
You're just looking at their track record to see what they've done.
And that allows the model to simulate how they might respond in the future.
So it's almost like...
It's like a chess game.
A chess game, right?
You're trying to anticipate their next move based on where the pieces are on the board.
And that's crucial.
It is, because the Fed's actions have a huge impact on the economy. I mean, raising interest rates can slow things down, lowering rates can speed things up.
It's all connected, right?
It is. It's a chain reaction.
One thing the Fed does can trigger all these other things.
Exactly.
Now, one of the things that stood out to me in this chapter is FAIR's analysis of how the Fed's behavior seems to have shifted since the 2008 financial crisis.
Right.
So he was basically putting his model to the test.
He was.
To see if it can pass the 2008 stress test.
Exactly.
Right. Because that was a pretty...
It was a big one.
Traumatic event.
A major turning point.
From the economy, so...
And what he found is really interesting.
Okay.
Because his model, based on that older data, didn't do a great job of explaining.
So the model was basically saying, this is what they should have done.
Right.
But they didn't do that.
And that suggests that something fundamental changed.
So the Fed almost had to
rip up the playbook.
Yeah.
And start over.
Because of this, unprecedented event.
Exactly.
I wonder if that's a temporary shift.
That's the million-dollar question.
Or if it's like a permanent change in how they're thinking about things.
And FAIR's model doesn't give us a definitive answer.
Okay.
But it does highlight that the Fed is not operating in a vacuum.
Right.
They're adapting and evolving just like the rest of us.
Well, this whole conversation is making me realize just how complex and dynamic this economic landscape is.
It's a wild ride.
It really is. There's no easy answers, is there?
Not in economics.
No magic bullet, huh?
No, it's more about understanding these relationships and using that knowledge to make informed decisions.
And that's what FAIR's model does.
That's what it's all about. Trying to make sense of the chaos.
I'm definitely feeling more informed.
Good.
And a lot less intimidated by the field of macroeconomics.
That's great to hear.
It's like we're getting this backstage pass.
Behind the scenes.
To see how it all works.
I like that analogy.
And speaking of gears turning.
Yes.
We haven't even talked about the role of government spending.
Government spending.
And how that fits into FAIR's model.
A very important piece of the puzzle.
Right. Those multipliers that we talked about earlier.
The multiplier.
How much bang did we get for our buck?
We'll see.
Okay. Well, before we dive into that, let's take a quick breather.
Sounds good.
To let all this new knowledge sink in.
Take a deep breath.
And when we come back, we'll explore that fascinating world of government spending and its impact.
Looking forward to it.
On the economy. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Before the break, we were getting ready to dive into those government spending multipliers.
Yes, those multipliers.
I know a little bit about this concept. It's basically... how much economic growth do you get for every dollar the government spends?
The bang for your buck.
Right, exactly. But I'm really curious to see how FAIR tackles this in his model.
Well, it's not as simple as it sounds, right?
So it's not like a vending machine.
Not quite, no.
You put in $1 and you get a can of soda out.
I wish it were that easy.
Yeah.
It's more like planting a seed,
Okay.
You put that seed in the ground.
That's the government spending.
Exactly. That's the government spending.
Okay.
But how much it grows depends on all sorts of things.
Like what?
The soil, the weather, all these external factors.
Gotcha. So FAIR's model is basically a way to...
Well, it's a tool to actually estimate those multipliers using real-world data.
So you're taking those real-world conditions into account.
Exactly. You run these simulations and see how different levels of spending play out.
So it's not just theoretical.
No, it's grounded in evidence.
It's actually looking at what happened in the past.
Exactly. That's what I love about FAIR's work.
And what are some of the insights that come out of that?
Well, one thing he found is that those multipliers might be smaller than a lot of people think.
really.
Smaller.
Especially in the long run.
Interesting. So government spending isn't necessarily...
Not always a quick fix, no.
No, it's not a magic bullet.
There's no such thing as a free lunch, right?
Right.
Even with government spending.
There are trade-offs. There are always trade-offs.
Okay, so we've talked about government spending.
Yeah.
But there was another key concept in this chapter.
Okay.
Okune's law, I think it was.
Okune's law.
It had something to do with unemployment.
Right. So Okune's law says that when the economy grows, unemployment tends to fall.
Which makes sense.
Right. It seems pretty intuitive.
Yeah.
But Fair's model kind of digs a little deeper.
So there's more to it than meets the eye.
Always. Remember we were talking about excess labor? You know, companies holding on to those extra workers?
Right.
Well, even when the economy starts growing, it might take a while.
Because they've already got the workers there.
Yeah, exactly. They can just increase production without immediately hiring more people.
Gotcha. So those companies have a little bit of a buffer.
They do.
Yeah.
And that's what Fair's model is really good at.
Yeah.
Capturing those little nuances.
Capturing all the complexities.
It's not a simple A leads to B kind of situation.
Right. It's like a whole chain reaction.
The economy's a living, breathing organism, right?
Wow, this whole conversation has given me like a whole new perspective on macroeconomics.
I'm glad to hear that.
It's fascinating, but it's really complex.
It is.
But I have to say, Fair's model makes it a lot less intimidating.
Good.
It's like he's giving us this backstage pass to see how it all works.
That's a great way to put it.
And you know what I really appreciate?
What's that?
Is that he doesn't just stop at building a theoretical model.
No, he puts it to work.
He actually tries to explain
real-world events.
The
booms and busts, financial crises, you name it.
So he can pinpoint the factors.
Yeah, he can look back and say, okay, this is what contributed to that recession.
So like with 2008, for example.
Right. He could show how a combination of things like oil prices, the housing bubble, loose monetary policy.
Wow.
All of those contributed to the crisis.
It's like piecing together this giant economic puzzle.
It is. It's like detective work almost.
Well, I have to say, this has been a truly eye-opening deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
I feel like I've learned so much.
I'm glad to hear it. It's a fascinating field.
It really is. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of macroeconomic modeling. It's complex, it's challenging, but it's incredibly rewarding to understand how the economy works. And as we've seen today, sometimes the most important insights come from challenging those conventional ways of thinking. And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts for more captivating deep dives like this one. And if you're enjoying the show and want to support us in creating more insightful content, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every contribution helps us continue this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.